in view of trying to go bigger and build a block of flats. 2 years in, that was rejected. Then I learned about sort of like site assembly, started building sort of other sites. So I've gone from sort of like HMOs to sort of quite large, housing schemes, which isn't necessarily the traditional route.
No, I like that because that's the reason why we named this topic Perseverance. It'll be good to get your views as to what your thought process was to get into property and why that made sense to you outside of other forms of investment.
I think it's probably leverage. Leverage is effectively borrowing money to purchase and control an asset. So in property, you put a deposit down, let's say you put 20% down, but you control 100% of that asset. In effect, you're 5 times leveraged. You've got 20% to control 100%.
This is the Property Development Book Club podcast. Please be advised that the views expressed are of the individuals and do not represent their employers and should not be taken as advice. Please do your own research and seek advice from an appointed professional.
Hello everyone, I'm Adewale from Property Development Book Club and you are tuned into a conversation on perseverance in property development with Chris Lesflores. Chris Lesflores is a property developer in Aspects Living. He's also the founder or co-founder of Property Ticks. So Chris, please tell us about your background and how you got involved in property development.
Yeah, go for it. All right, so I did the traditional education route. I did my law degree, professional law exams. I went into banking. Banking's still my day job. Very early on, I decided that I wanted to get into property. I think I started saving for my first property when I was probably about 22. I managed to purchase it when I was 26. That was a large Victorian house in Croydon, which I managed to convert into a HMO, and I managed to scale from there.
What is a HMO? What does it stand for?
It's housing of multiple occupation. So by definition, it is a house with 3 or more unrelated people who are sharing facilities. You need licensing for it. It's quite difficult to get now, but that's, I guess, the legal definition of what it is. I was quite cheeky. I was a contractor, so I had quite a high day rate. So I basically purchased, I lived in the properties, purchased them on very high sort of geared mortgages, would renovate them and then remortgage on professional HMO mortgages, and then rinsed and repeat. In terms of the actual development, I think I had loads of HMO deals that fell through. Each time I got somewhat more irritated and aggravated, went bigger and bigger. Eventually I was offered this massive Victorian house. I think it was 8 beds, it's about 350 square meters, and it had land at the back, which could house a separate dwelling. That fell through as well. And then from then on, I kind of worked out that actually, development's quite an attractive and lucrative industry. So I started looking for sites with large gardens. Several more of those fell through. Eventually, I managed to find a house. It was a detached house that had quite a large space on the side. I went through the planning application process. It was quite simple. It was just an extension, and actually got that through, but decided not to progress. In view of trying to go bigger and build a block of flats. 2 years in, that was rejected. Then I learned about sort of like site assembly, started building sort of other sites, and sort of kind of went bigger and bigger. So I've gone from sort of like HMOs to sort of quite large, housing schemes, which isn't necessarily the traditional route, but.
No, I like that because that's the reason why we named this topic Perseverance, because
right, that's me,
there's been a lot of bumps along the road, which hopefully we get to explore shortly. So you talked about your rents. Obviously you get HMOs, rents, refinance, and you just keep repeating it. Can you tell us what your strategy was, what your thought process was when you were going through those deals? Because you get a lot of people in high income jobs, like investment banking, they wouldn't know. All they know is how to invest their money into stocks and shares. Not many people know how to do alternative investments. Real estate, as weird as it is, as big and substantial as it is still considered an alternative investment.
Yeah.
So it'll be good to get your views as to how you decided and what your thought process was to get into property and why that made sense to you outside of other forms of investment.
Okay. I think it's probably leverage. There aren't many asset classes that you can benefit from leverage.
And leverage, if we were to just expand, because we've got quite a few listeners that may not understand. So what does leverage mean?
Leverage is effectively borrowing money to purchase and control an asset. So in property, you put a deposit down, let's say you put 20% down, but you control 100% of that asset. In effect, you're 5 times leveraged. You've got 20% to control 100%.
Yeah.
100 divided by 20 is 5. You can do that with margin stocks and shares and so on and so forth, but it's a lot riskier, and typically the charges are a lot greater.
Yeah.
So at the time that I got involved in property, property was probably increasing a few percent a year or so. If you're 5% leveraged, or sort of 5 times leveraged, rather, or in fact, in my case, 20 times leveraged, your growth is exponential. Quite literally, you're talking sort of 40 to 60% growth year on year from the capital that you put in, and that's how I was able to scale quite quickly.
That's very interesting, because that the term leverage, it obviously comes from the term lever.
Yeah.
Obviously, when people used to carry stones, and I'm sure it goes all the way back to Egyptian times, you put a pulley at the top,
multiple levers,
and you hold it so a natural man can lift like a ton stone.
Still use it today. Yeah.
And that leverage is effectively what he's talking about, which is you use a little to control a lot, which is, you explained very, very good. So the next one is, you have a career in banking.
Yeah.
You have obviously a background in law. So in my personal opinion, I always think a good property developer has 2 fundamental skills. So my superpower is numbers, and I studied property development. That's my superpower. Yeah. But I won't say I'm jealous, but people that come from an investment banking background have a very good understanding of sources of finance, how to raise investment, and how to make sure that they're presenting their case to investors very clearly, so there's a clear exit. So that's one element. But you've also got something else, which I'm jealous about, which is your legal degree.
All right, okay.
So I wanted to know, with your background in law, studied it for a few years, then you also have your investment banking background, or the investment background. How has that helped you in property development?
Okay, that's a good question. In honesty, I don't think law has many transferable skills. In retrospect, law probably wasn't for me as a degree, despite doing 4 years of legal studies. I did graduate. I'm somewhat more pragmatic, and I think to be a property developer, you have to be a lot more pragmatic.
Of course.
Law is very, very black letter. It is, let's follow precedent, or legal sort of resolutions that have already been sort of decided, or black letter, read text, and verbatim, this is how law applies. In property, you need to be creative in the solutions. In effect, your reward is directly proportional to the risk and problems you solve, and that's not really taught in law. I definitely think it requires a certain kind of person and skill set to be a lawyer. I take my hat off to them. I don't think I could do it. So law, maybe not so much. For investment banking, analysis is probably the backbone or cornerstone of development. Yeah. So yes, I think it's probably helped. Again, in honesty, I don't necessarily know that there are directly transferable skills. I'm probably a little bit arrogant in my opinions on a lot. I'm very much of the opinion that I can probably solve any problem. And that's part of my day job as well. That's quite literally what I'm paid to do. So any problem that I come across, I know that I can speak to people, sympathise and understand what's required or what the problem statement is, and fix it in an objective-led manner. And I think that's key to really being a good property developer, focusing on the objective and then focusing on the steps you need to take to reach that objective. Yeah, and not many people necessarily know that. So if you have a job that maybe lends itself to fixing those kind of problems, then yes, there are transferable skills.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because it talks about the problems, and there are a lot of problems in development that are, because we had the person that we just had on, he talked about, we had a conversation about the political end of things, and I questioned whether there was a disconnect between the political aspirations and what happens. But we are thrown a lot of curveballs
Yeah.
in property development that are either known, unknown, or things that people just want to throw because they have something near them to throw.
Correct.
If
Exactly
that makes sense.
Exactly that.
So just going back to, you talked about law. Believe it or not, you talked a lot. I think what you mentioned is that you don't feel law is, but development in its very nature is very process driven.
Fair,
Mainly
fair.
because obviously we've got the Town and Country Planning Act, which is law, understanding how to intercept that. We've also have planning policies.
Yeah.
Now, I am a Christian, but you know, like when we look at how you, like when you do essays and stuff,
Yep.
always have to reference back to something. I think law enables you to be able to know what the base response is for a point that's raised by the local authority. So if you are submitting a planning application for whatever reason, they reject it, and it's for unfound reasons, you know you've got a strong case in appeal, which I'm sure we're going to get to shortly.
Fair. No, I can see that. Yeah.
So that your mindset, I think speaking to you, and we've been speaking for a number of years, I can see that methodical part that you spoke about, but I can also see the benefit of your training through legal. So
Thank
that's
you.
clearly a
Maybe
good
there
thing.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all in there. So we're now going to move over to something about your journey, because this conversation is about perseverance, yeah? And you have gone through a process, because I think that what I really like about speaking to you, and if you follow him on Aspect Living on Instagram, phenomenal page, he talks about the reality. You find a lot of property professionals, they never talk about the downside of our industry. He has received a ridiculous amount of planning rejections. He's gone to a planning appeals various different times and unfortunately had his cases dismissed. But that in itself builds perseverance and maturity as well as understanding. So how long did it take you to secure your first planning permission for a new development?
Right, so my first ever planning approval was actually about 16 weeks, and that was the site that I built or wanted to build, which was an extension onto a detached house. My first ground up scheme in totality was probably just over 4 years or so, and that involved the application for initially, I think, an 8 unit flat scheme that was reduced to 6 units on pre-app or after pre-app. That was rejected. The appeal took the best part of 10 months or so, which was also dismissed. In that time, I managed to acquire 2 other sites or neighbouring sites and pulled together another scheme, which was originally 9 houses. That was reduced after pre-app again, and we got 7 units put through. Again, that was probably a 2-year process in total, and that was rejected initially. And then on appeal, quite literally, I think a week and a half before the option expired, the appeal was successful. So probably a fairly hectic week and a half, as you can imagine.
So speaking about the ground up process, and that was your first major application that you got approved, how long was it from the day in which you started that project all the way through to the day that you got the appeal approved?
About 4 years.
4-year process.
Yeah, 4 years.
So
and a lot of
basically,
money.
the same amount of time it took you to finish university.
Yeah, quite literally. Yeah.
Yeah, that is quite phenomenal. And the reason why I wanted to highlight that point is for people to understand that property development, for some people believe that it's a get rich quick. In our industry, it is literally a question of time and opportunity.
A lot of people don't understand that.
Yeah, people don't speak about that. Planning processes from ground up, and I'm sure there's various people that may listen, ground up development is a procedural process that takes a lot of time. So it's just something to be mindful of. That's 4 years of your life.
It is. And that's not even built yet.
It's not even built
I've got
yet.
to discharge conditions, actually go through the build. So overall, we're probably talking a 6 to 7 year program. Yeah, overall, I think most people probably earn more in a day job than they do sort of doing things like that.
Yes.
It's not.
So if you were to atomize your time into an hourly rate, you're probably getting a lot less than minimum wage. If you were to look at the amount of time involved.
100%.
So it's not property development. I know it appears to be sexy, but there's various other things that could go wrong, and it takes a lot of time. So thank you very much for sharing that. Now, this is a question that me and you have spoken about a lot, about local authorities and whether you feel that local authorities support small house builders.
Yep.
Clearly, you've gone through planning processes on various different schemes. You've gone to pre-applications, which you've spent sizable amounts of monies for. And where you've gone through all of these processes, you're still running into the same issues. The question I want to ask you is, do you think that there is genuine support for small builders through the planning process?
That depends. So a few months ago, I would have probably said no. And my general opinion is that I think there is a vested interest to ensure that small businesses as a whole don't do as well as maybe they could. I think that there is a political interest to ensure that we have as many large corporations or organisations providing as many jobs as possible. It's a way of collecting tax revenue very easily, rather than chasing several million SMEs or self-employed individuals. And on top of that, I think that there is a vested interest for large money managers, asset managers, hedge funds, so on and so forth, to build to rent, or alternatively acquire sort of large swathes of estates. If you look at Lloyd's, who wants to be the UK's largest landlord. You've got M&G, Mundi, BlackRock, who own swathes of housing. So I think that as time goes on, it will become increasingly more difficult for small house builders and small enterprises in general to succeed or have the success that we historically saw in the past. However, with that said, there are some planning boroughs who I've worked with who have been phenomenal. I recently put forward an application in Southwark, and their whole entire planning department is amazing. I didn't think that anything like this existed. The application was validated immediately. The planning officer reached out to me 2 days in. They've spent time coming back and responding to me via emails. I've seen them on site twice. They've discussed objections with me. In comparison, if you look at other boroughs, which I won't name, one specifically, I don't think I heard, in fact, I didn't get one email in the 2 years that my flatted scheme was going through approval. And that was one of the reasons I cited on the appeal documents, that I had no communication, no site visit or anything from the planning officer.
Interesting.
So it depends. It really does depend.
I think that's a very balanced view. I'm glad that Southwark Council, and I know a few people there, so great job to you guys. Obviously, I'm very glad to hear that you've had a positive experience, because I have a very different opinion for small developers, but it's not my interview.
No. Fair.
But I've had a very bad experience, but I'm sure we'll probably discuss that after this, to be fair. But I think the good thing is that you're balanced, you're optimistic, which is great. And I want to ask a question, because obviously you're into property development through Aspect Living, and you've done phenomenal work, and you've got option agreements, you've got all types of stuff. The final question was talking about your prop tech business, which is called Property Ticks.
Proptics.
Proptics. Apologies. I'll say that again. We're going to talk about your business called Proptics. Can you tell us a bit about it and what you're hoping to try to deliver with your business?
Yeah, sure. So myself and one of my business partners, Dennis, Ratio Property, shout out, decided to build a appraisal platform that small developers could use, in effect, to try to automate.
To interject, what is an appraisal, just for people to understand what an appraisal is?
So whenever you do any property development or you see a site, you need to appraise a property. In effect, you're looking at, okay, what can I purchase the site for or the property for? What can I do with this? How much is that going to cost me? And what's the end value likely to be? Based on those factors, you can work out your profit, your gross profit or your profit margins, to work out whether it's something that is worthwhile. It's the basis of every scheme. We're in property to make money. It's the harsh reality of it. However, in order to do an appraisal, you need more than just the numbers. You need to look at the local market. You need to look at what are the sales in the area. What have other 3 beds sold for, or 2-bed flats, or is there a demand for that? And that's really a problem that we're trying to solve. So a lot of people aren't necessarily great at Excel, formulas, so on and so forth. If you said to the average person, calculate your gross profit margin or profit on cost, or IRR, so on and so forth, or do some sensitivity analysis, they wouldn't have a Scooby what you're talking about. All these ratios are ratios or metrics that lenders look at and expect you to kind of know before they consider lending. So what we do is we provide a platform where you can enter in your GDV, your development value, you can enter in your costs, the phases of your works, your schedule, your team. You get all your ratios calculated. We've got a finance estimator based on 1% a month, 12% term, 70% LTV, all that stuff.
LTV being loan to value.
Loan to value. Yeah.
Okay.
Your development cost. Your development LTV as well. How much you want to actually borrow in terms of your build costs.
Yes.
We calculate all the ratios for that. We provide a market analysis tool so that you can validate your figures. In effect, it provides you a finance-ready pack to submit to a lender with everything they need in a standard templated manner, which aims to, in effect, alleviate all the pain points of manual filing, Excels everywhere, A&L, asset and liability statements. All of it's in one place to make, in effect, financing a property as easy as possible.
Interesting. That is very, very interesting. I'm glad, and I would obviously look forward to getting you and Dennis on, hopefully to a future season, to talk about PropTix as and when it becomes available. But that is very exciting. But I would like to thank you for coming today, because ultimately we've been able to discuss your journey of perseverance to get into a successful position on the projects that you've now got, which is 8 houses, I believe.
Yep.
Which is amazing. And then we also talked about your business and your background in getting into business. So Chris, would like to thank you in aspect, as well as PropTix, for being involved in this episode, and look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Racing up the road.